To understand the story of Émile Louis is to immerse oneself in the specific social, geographical, and judicial landscape of rural France in the 1970s. It is a story that unfolds not as a single linear narrative, but as a slow, creeping dread, a puzzle whose pieces were scattered and ignored for 2 decades before being violently forced together. We must begin not with the killer, but with the world he preyed upon. The Yone department, south of Paris, is part of the Burgundy region. In the 1970s, it was a place of quiet villages, vast farmlands, and deep forests. Life was traditional, often insular. The city of Auxerre was the hub, but the surrounding hamlets were worlds unto themselves. In this environment, families with intellectually disabled children had few resources. State institutions were often grim, and the prevailing attitude was one of shame and secrecy. Many families kept their disabled children at home, hidden from view. The creation of specialized workshops, CATs, was a step forward, offering training and a semblance of a productive life. For families in villages like Chablis, Toussy, or Cosson-les-Carrières, this meant their daughters could learn a skill and socialize. But it also meant they had to travel, and they were utterly dependent on the transport provided. This transport was a lifeline, but in the case of the ADAPI, Departmental Association for the Development of Specialized Education minibus, it became a vehicle of death. The driver was the gatekeeper, the sole guardian during these journeys through the isolated countryside. That driver was Émile Louis. Émile Louis was born on October 10, 1934, in Porain, Yone. His childhood was unremarkable on the surface, but those who knew him later would speak of a deeply ingrained cruelty and a volatile temper. He worked as a mechanic, a trade that gave him a practical competence, but also a familiarity with tools, machinery, and the isolated garages and barns that would later feature in the investigation. He was not an intellectual, he was a man of brute force and simple, brutal appetites. He married, but his marriage was marked by violence and domination. His wife, Simone, and his stepdaughter, living under his roof, were themselves victims of his tyrannical nature. This domestic terror is a critical element of the story, for it was within this private sphere that his secret would fester and eventually burst forth. In 1971, Louis was hired by ADAPI. He was a familiar face, he knew the back roads intimately, and he likely presented himself as a reliable, if rough, character. He was given a white minibus and a roster of passengers, young women, mostly in their late teens and early 20s, with mental ages far younger than their years. They were trusting, naive, and utterly powerless. To Louis, they were not human beings, they were objects. He quickly established a routine of control and petty cruelties, often demanding kisses or small favours from them, testing their boundaries. The families, grateful for the service and often intimidated by Louis, largely ignored these warning signs. The vanishings began in the mid-1970s, a period of 7 terrible months. Bernadette Lemoine, 21, disappeared on October 23, 1975. She was last seen getting into Louis' minibus. Maurice Bresson, 20, vanished on December 11, 1975. Same story. Marie-Angèle Domis, 19, disappeared on January 22, 1976. Jean-Marie Desrameaux, 20, vanished on February 19, 1976. Michel Roux, 19, disappeared on March 11, 1976. Marie-Thérèse Lembleu, 21, vanished on April 8, 1976. Françoise Lemoine, 22, no relation to Bernadette, disappeared on May 6, 1977. The pattern was stark and should have been alarmingly obvious. 7 young women from the same specialized workshop, all passengers on the same minibus, all vanishing on days when the same man was driving. They vanished without a trace. No personal items were found, no bodies discovered, they simply ceased to exist. The family's anguish was met with a wall of institutional indifference. When they went to the gendarmerie, they were patronized. The official theory, rarely stated explicitly but always implied, was that these girls were unstable, promiscuous, or had simply run away to Paris. The files were categorized as disturbing disappearances, not potential homicides. There was no major search operation, no forensic investigation, no serious interrogation of Émile Louis. He was questioned cursorily a few times, but he simply denied any knowledge, and the authorities accepted his word. The families, many of them poor farmers or labourers, lacked the social or political clout to demand more. Their daughters were the disposable ones, and the system had written them off. The minibus continued its route, with Louis at the wheel. The first crack in Louis's armour came from a different crime altogether. On November 1st, 1975, just over a week after Bernadette Lemoine disappeared, a 17-year-old girl named Monique Olivier was found brutally raped and murdered in a forest near Toussy. She had been hitchhiking. The investigation eventually led to Émile Louis. Witnesses placed him in the area, and his violent nature made him a suspect. However, the judicial process was slow. It wasn't until 1984 that he was finally tried, convicted, and sentenced to 20 years in prison for Monique Olivier's murder. This conviction was crucial. It officially marked Louis as a murderer and put him behind bars. Prison is a world of strange codes and confessions. Sometime in the early 1990s, Louis found himself sharing space with Francis Heilm, the stroller killer, a man who would become one of France's most notorious serial offenders. Heilm, a keen observer of criminal psychology, later told investigators that Louis had boasted to him. He spoke of killing the retarded girls from his bus route, claiming he had done away with 7 of them. Heilm, who himself traded information for favours, passed this on to the gendarmes. It was a significant lead, but it was the testimony of a serial killer against another, and it wasn't enough to reopen a cold case. The true breakthrough came from the most intimate source, his own family. The years of Louis's imprisonment had given his wife, Simone, and his stepdaughter a respite from his tyranny. But they lived with a horrible secret. During a particularly violent family argument in 1992, while Louis was on a temporary release from prison, he had exploded in a rage. Furious and wanting to terrorize them further, he confessed. He told them he had killed 7 girls. He called them sluts and said they had asked for it. Most chillingly, he drew a rough map on a piece of paper indicating a forest near the village of Diege, and claimed that was where he had buried them. This confession haunted Simone and her daughter for years. Finally, burdened by guilt and fear, and perhaps sensing a chance for freedom from his shadow, they went to the police in June 1997 and told them everything. They provided the map. This new evidence was impossible to ignore. The case was assigned to investigating magistrate Marie-Odile Bertella Geffroy, a tenacious and determined jurist who would become a central figure in the pursuit of justice. The file was officially reopened in 2000. The media, led by relentless journalists, seized upon the story. It had all the elements of a major scandal, vulnerable victims, a monstrous killer, and a justice system that had slept for 2 decades. The families of the victims, now organized and supported by a sympathetic public, found their voice. They gave heartbreaking interviews describing their years of pain and their fight against an indifferent bureaucracy. The investigation now moved with urgency. The area near Daigis was searched extensively. However, no bodies were ever found. Louis had likely moved them, or his map was a deliberate deception. The case against him would have to be built on circumstantial evidence and testimony. In March 2001, Émile Louis was charged with the murders of the 7 young women. He was transferred from the prison where he was serving his sentence for the Olivier murder to a house of arrest in Versailles to await trial. The trial began on November 15, 2004, at the Cour d'Assises in Auxerre, the very city from which the victims had disappeared almost 30 years earlier. The courtroom was packed with journalists, lawyers, and, most poignantly, the aging parents and siblings of the 7 girls. The atmosphere was electric with long-suppressed emotion. Émile Louis, now 70 years old, was the spectacle's dark heart. He was not a charming, manipulative killer. He was belligerent, vulgar, and openly contemptuous. He retracted his confession entirely, claiming his wife and stepdaughter had fabricated the story out of spite. He insulted the victims' families, calling them liars and gold diggers. He showed not a flicker of remorse. When the president of the court asked him what he had to say to the families, he snarled, "Nothing at all." The prosecution's case was a detailed tapestry of circumstance. They presented the timeline, demonstrating his exclusive opportunity. They detailed his known violence, as evidenced by the Olivier murder, the testimony of his wife and stepdaughter about the 1992 confession was devastating, despite Louis's attempts to discredit them. Francis Heilmer was called to the stand, a bizarre and unsettling figure who calmly recounted Louis's prison boasts. The defense, for its part, argued that there was no physical evidence, no bodies, no murder weapon, no forensic links. They painted the case as one built on hearsay and the unreliable words of a vengeful family and a fellow killer. For the families in the courtroom, the trial was a catharsis and a renewed torment. They finally had their day in court, but they had to endure the vile presence of the man they believed had destroyed their lives. They held up photographs of their smiling daughters, sisters, and nieces, forcing the court to see them as they were. Vibrant, loved, and full of life, not the simple stereotypes they had been reduced to. After weeks of dramatic testimony, the jury retired. On June 28, 2005, the verdict was read. Émile Louis was found guilty of the murders of 6 of the 7 young women: Bernadette Lemoine, Maryse Bresson, Marie-Angèle Domis, Jeanne-Marie Desframeaux, Michel Roux, and Marie-Thérèse Lemblin. The charge for the murder of Françoise Lemoine was dismissed for lack of evidence. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a mandatory minimum term of 22 years. There was no celebration in the courtroom, only a profound, weary sense of relief. Justice, though delayed for decades, had finally been served. Louis continued to proclaim his innocence until the end. He died of cancer on October 4, 2013, in the prison hospital at La Santé in Paris at the age of 79. He never offered any closure to the families, never revealed the location of the bodies. The legacy of the Émile Louis affair is deep and painful. It forced France to confront its own prejudices and the incompetence of its judicial and police institutions. The disappeared of the Yone became a symbol of the fight for the rights of the disabled and the marginalized. The case led to concrete changes: the creation of a national database for missing persons, new protocols for investigating the disappearances of vulnerable adults, and a greater awareness of the need to listen to families, no matter their social status. The 7 young women were not forgotten. Their names are now etched in the memory of a nation, a tragic reminder of what happens when a society looks away.